I'm now going to be building on what Diane has talked about in the sense of understanding both inputs and also the processes and how they happen within organisations. So what we can understand, and we were highlighting this within the animation, is that being in an organisation has these unintended consequences, both in terms of exposing us to people who are very different, but also in giving us a range of very different emotions that can sometimes lead us to feel very negative about our experiences. And so what we can end up is either a situation where we have a bad barrel, or we have maybe a denuded barrel, so in different ways. So what work psychology in particular is not going to provide is a crystal ball to let you look into the future and understand things. But in particular, what it is able to do is to help you understand who's coming through your door and whether you want to regulate them. And then to try and understand knock-on consequences, so to be more predictive and upstream regulation. So we did a study, myself and Caris Rice, and I'd like to acknowledge her work in this area with a number of the slides that we got. And we were collecting case studies about bad practices that happen within organisations. And what we found here was that this was a situation where somebody was a hoarder behaviour, and the organisations were very shocked about it, but actually the seeds, if you like, of what was going to happen were already there. And so what we found was that right at the selection of this individual, there were some very important telltale signs. This is somebody who had very high conscientiousness, but they also had a kind of obsessive behaviour around that contributed to their hoarding. And also they had some social skill issues that meant that they were able to hide in different ways the behaviour that they were doing again. And so what we found in this situation was the use of humour that really helped people, and Roberta is going to be talking about this shortly, that really helped people start to morally decline, and they weren't necessarily aware of what was happening. And so what we found was that the change of boss, as Diane's kind of indicated, had a very positive effect in this situation by reminding people about their security practices. But then there was another wider change in attitude, and also there was a major life event for this person. So they weren't aware, they were stressed, they were not aware of their behaviour. And all of this was happening in a context where there were a wide variety of social systems, but also organisational systems that weren't picking up and regulating this particular person's behaviour. So what we can see in this study was how much change actually overwhelms people. So this was an organisation that was having massive change, both to the people coming into the organisation. They were much more inclusive and diverse, but that was very different to their previous type of people coming in. They also were changing the workplace, literally, with the offices and different facilities around. They were having huge transition in terms of who was coming in at the top of the organisation, but also what they were expecting leaders to do. And then all of this was happening against some major policy changes. So both in terms of changing how they progressed people through the organisation, but also massive shifts in terms of pensions and pension provision and redundancy programmes. So this was all happening together and was having a really very strong impact on individuals, and particularly in terms of that pension change, it was making people feel that they couldn't come back, they couldn't alter their destinies because they got so much invested in this organisation, they literally couldn't quit. And we've seen through the pandemic, how things can overwhelm people and that we can start to go awry. But in particular, what we might like to be aware of is who is leaving our organisation and whether they're taking some things with them. And that can be knowledge as well as other assets. Or who might be becoming sensitised and feeling overwhelmed or feeling very angry in different ways. And Roberta is going to be talking about this very shortly. So in particular, let me just very briefly highlight our work on looking at opening the door and how this impacts. So in particular, the work we've done with professional standards, what we were showing in this slide is just what happens where people who have a qualifications fraud, what other things are they doing? So we found that there was a real association both with people not complying and doing their work properly, and in a more critical way for other professions in terms of other forms of dishonesty and police conviction and drug convictions. So again, people that fake qualifications are likely to also do other things. So we found in particular, and again, you can see in this quote about somebody that poor reference checking, again, allows people to come in. So this particular member of staff had already been dismissed by his professional body, but had neglected to inform his future employers about that. And what we've also found, as you can see in this slide, was not only that references were a concern, but that within this context, there was a network of reference fakers who were each supplying each other with fake references. So what's important in this context is you can see that you get different networks. So in particular, you can see with the small network of people who were within the same institution, it would allow you to pull out those individuals and sack those individuals. With the other one, you can see my bearded man. These were actually going across different networks. So again, they were able to look at and detect these folk in very different ways, using work psychology to understand that. So in particular, one of the most interesting ways that work psychology can help is thinking about upstream interventions and prevention and detection in different ways. So in particular, what we found is that there can be starts of processes, in particular around where people perceive that there is an integrity breach. And so what you find here, again, linked into that earlier issue to do with pensions, you can see people starting to complain and feeling that psychologically the organisation took away that provision for them and that they didn't feel that it was looking after them in the same way. So they really perceived that the organisation had let them down. And what we see there is that people really start to change their attributions. In particular, again, a sense that, well, I used to think this was the right organisation, but it doesn't value me. It's not getting the best out of me. So seeing things differently. And from that, people can start to become very cynical within the organisation. And you'll see on the next. So we're always being promised this and that. It's been going on. There's a healthy level of cynicism. And cynicism is a really important emotion because as a result of that, as you'll see in the next one, people start to have moral disengagement. And this happens in 4 distinct ways. So first of all, they can start to reconstruct events to their advantage. Also, they can start to view themselves as not having agency so that they can displace the responsibility onto other people, or they can start to minimize the outcomes and consequences. And finally, they can start to change the target and either dehumanize them or to blame the other person for that. So these are the moral disengagement mechanisms. So what we can see there is that moral disengagement starting to happen. And the next quote, so this person is saying, well, because I'm not the line manager, I'm not going to be monitoring and detecting other people. I'm not going to take people under their wing because that's the manager's job. It's not my problem. So again, in terms of an organisation, as you'll see on the final slide of this little set, they actually create this active and passive insider threat within a business that builds in different ways. So you can see what we find in particular around fraud behaviours is that this is a repeat behaviour. And again, it's associated with a variety of different practices so that we might detect somebody whose poor prescription behaviour is actually indicative of the fact that they are doing a much larger scale fraud. So these are important repeat behaviours. And what Bandura helps us understand is that we have the behaviours that people do, we have insights in terms of the person and marking out people that are more likely to do this, but also there's an environmental context. And so each of these are co-determinants, each fueling and bringing on in different ways to advance those negative behaviours within organisations. But if you look at the next slide, this is happening around a framework that can inhibit. So through using self-evaluation and self-reflection, people can be aware of their own behaviours. Also where there's social sanctions, where people are checking and looking and monitoring those people, or where, as Diane highlighted before, where there's legal sanctions. So there's some kind of recourse within the organisation and more widely to your bad behaviours. So what we see in particular is that we're able to really identify hotspots. Again, we've been using climate data to identify places where that moral disengagement would be more likely, and therefore you're likely to get it. And we found this particularly looking at sexual abuse and harassment situations. And in particular, in terms of upstream work around reducing sexual violence, we were able to show that it was workplaces that had long working hours, limited training, particularly around diversity and inclusion, but also had latent levels of interpersonal violence. And that was both staff on staff, but also service users on staff. All of these were depleting organisations that were likely to have higher incidence. Whereas in contrast, we found that places that staff were reporting good communication between themselves and management and had higher levels of training, particularly around diversity and inclusion, were able to restore and enable people to carry on. So what you can see here is that we need to understand trust processes in different ways. So in the past, we focused on trust building, and then you can also see we've also focused on trust repairing, but increasingly we need to be thinking about this in terms of trust preserving, and really understanding how far we can stretch things. So in particular, what we've been identifying from recent work is 3 different practices that organisations can do to preserve trust and ensure that all of those change programmes and change processes don't overwhelm people that I was talking about earlier on in this presentation. And in particular, thinking about what the role of leaders are in helping these situations and also mobilising those trust foundations. So in particular, the takeaways for you are that there is real value for work psychology, in particular in terms of reducing risk, both by paying attention to your input controls, but also those process controls, so understanding which processes might undermine you, and then thinking that it's not just about individuals, it's understanding how those social relations, workplace norms, and also failure to have sanctions and consequences can impact. And in particular, we can use those to help focus our resources so that we can identify these hotspots that could be workplaces of concerns, they could be changes like the pension issue I was talking about of concern, or procedures, and also in terms of relationships to watch. So on my final slide, I've just got a list of all of the resources that we've used to build this, and I'd like to thank my colleagues who I've worked with in creating these. And I'd also now like to hand over to my amazing colleague, Roberta, to do our next presentation. Thank you.